Every nation hides its sins behind flags and anthems. But beneath America's shining promise of freedom lies a shadow, one that stretches across centuries, across blood and borders. The United States, the land of liberty, has built its identity on ideals of courage, justice, and progress. Yet behind the monuments, the textbooks, and the proud speeches, there exists another America. An America written not in ink, but in silence. For every story of triumph, there is one that was buried. For every anthem sung, a cry that went unheard. These are not legends or wild conspiracies, but truths carefully hidden in the folds of history. Forgotten by design, erased by power, rewritten by those who feared what the truth might reveal. In the shadows of this nation's past lies a collection of secrets, so dark they challenge the very meaning of freedom. 10 moments when ideals were betrayed, when democracy turned against its own reflection, and when the cost of progress was measured in lives. What if the country we celebrate is not the full story? What if the foundation of liberty was built upon deception, control, and sacrifice that no one was meant to remember? This is not a tale of hate. It is a search for truth. Because only by facing the darkness within history can we begin to see the light that still tries to break through. History is never just a record of what happened. It is a mirror held up by those who survived, those who triumphed, and those who chose what the rest of us would remember. In America, that mirror has always been polished to shine bright, to reflect liberty and opportunity. But beneath that polished surface are scratches and fractures that tell a deeper story, one that is often uncomfortable, sometimes horrifying, and always revealing. From the beginning, the United States has carried within it two parallel stories. One is the story of freedom, courage, and innovation, told in classrooms and celebrated on holidays. The other is quieter, more elusive, stitched into the hidden corners of archives and memories. It is the story of what was taken, concealed, or rewritten to protect an image of perfection. These buried truths do not destroy the American dream. They explain it. They reveal the cost of creating it, the price paid by those who had no voice. The purpose of uncovering these secrets is not to condemn, but to understand. To see how ambition and fear, progress and prejudice, have often walked side by side through the corridors of American power. Each secret tells of a decision made in the shadows, a compromise of morality for control, or an act of cruelty justified by the promise of a greater good. For generations, many of these events were dismissed as conspiracy, myth, or irrelevant to the present. Yet when the truth finally surfaced, it showed how deeply these choices shaped the world we live in today. They shaped the systems of trust and distrust, the institutions that govern us, and even the way we define what it means to be free. In this journey, we will travel across time and truth. We will visit the forgotten genocide of the continent's first peoples, the covert plots of generals and spies, the experiments that blurred the line between science and evil, and the betrayals that took place within the heart of democracy itself. This is not a list of scandals. It is a story of how darkness often grows in the shadow of light. It is a reminder that every flag waves not only for what a nation has achieved, but for what it has tried to hide. These are the 10 dark secrets buried in the pages of American history, waiting to be seen, not as stories of shame, but as warnings carved into the foundation of a country still learning how to tell the truth. 1. The Forgotten Genocide, Native America's silent erasure. Long before there was a nation called the United States, there were countless nations already here. They had their own languages, beliefs, and ways of life. The forests, the plains, and the rivers carried the stories of people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. But when European settlers arrived, they saw not a civilization, but an opportunity. The continent was seen as empty, waiting to be claimed, even though millions already called it home. The story of America's founding is often told as one of courage and discovery, of pioneers building a new world from wilderness. But that wilderness was never empty. It was cleared village by village, by blood and fire. What followed was not a single act of war, but a slow, systematic campaign to erase entire peoples. Treaties were signed, only to be broken. Promises were made, only to be forgotten. The new nation's hunger for land became a machine that devoured everything in its path. By the early 1800s, that machine had a name: Manifest Destiny. It was the belief that Americans were chosen by God to expand westward, that conquest was not only inevitable but righteous. Under this banner, native nations were pushed from their homelands through forced marches like the Trail of Tears. Thousands of men, women, and children died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion as they were driven from the lands that had sustained their ancestors for generations. Yet the genocide did not end with relocation. The United States government realized that to control a people, it was not enough to take their land. It was necessary to take their identity. In the late 19th century, children were torn from their families and sent to boarding schools run by the government and the church. There, they were beaten for speaking their native languages. Their hair was cut, their names replaced, their gods forbidden. The motto of these schools was chillingly simple: kill the Indian, save the man. This was not a side note of history. It was policy. It was the deliberate attempt to extinguish an entire culture under the pretense of civilization. Generations grew up disconnected from their roots, their traditions fragmented by fear and shame. Many of the languages spoken before colonization are now gone forever, their last speakers silenced within living memory. Even in the modern era, the legacy of this erasure continues. Reservations, often placed on the least fertile lands, became symbols of survival and despair. Poverty, addiction, and suicide rose in communities that had once been thriving nations. The trauma of forced assimilation passed from parent to child, an invisible inheritance of loss. And while the nation celebrated progress, the truth of its foundation remained buried beneath patriotic myths. In textbooks, Native history was often reduced to a chapter, a tragedy that ended with surrender. But the truth is far more complex. Native America did not disappear. It endured. Despite every attempt to erase it, the spirit of those First Nations continues to fight for recognition, for land rights, for the revival of languages once forbidden to speak. Their survival is not a footnote, but an act of defiance against centuries of silence. The forgotten genocide of Native America is not forgotten by those who lived it. It lingers in the stories told around fires, in the ceremonies that still survive, and in the quiet resilience of those who refuse to vanish. The question is not whether history remembers them, but whether we choose to listen. Because only when we face what was taken can we understand the true cost of the land we now call home. 2. Operation Northwoods. The plan to deceive America in the early 1960s, the world stood on the edge of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War had turned from a battle of ideology into a test of survival. The United States feared the spread of communism like a disease, and Cuba, a small island just 90 miles from Florida, had become the newest threat. Under Fidel Castro, the revolution had triumphed, and suddenly the Soviet Union had a foothold in America's own backyard. Fear turned into desperation, and desperation into something darker. In 1962, top military leaders within the United States drafted a plan that defied belief. Its name was Operation Northwoods. On paper, it was described as a pretext to justify military intervention in Cuba. In reality, it was a blueprint for deception. The plan proposed a series of fake terrorist attacks, staged hijackings, and orchestrated explosions on American soil. Civilians would be harmed, and the chaos would be blamed on Cuba. The goal was simple but chilling: to manufacture public outrage so that Americans would demand war. It was not a rogue idea. The proposal came directly from the highest levels of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military body in the nation. They argued that deception was a necessary evil, that the ends justified the means. They believed that if the people could not be convinced by truth, they could be led by fear. The plan even included a scenario in which a civilian airliner would be shot down and blamed on Castro's forces. Every detail was laid out, every lie prepared to sound real. When the document reached President John F. Kennedy's desk, he was appalled. Kennedy rejected the plan outright and made it clear that no such deception would ever be carried out under his command. But the mere fact that the plan had been written, reviewed, and approved by military leaders revealed something deeply unsettling about how fragile truth could be in times of fear. The document was quietly buried, locked away in the archives of secrecy, and for decades, no one outside of a few officials knew it existed. It was only in the 1990s, after the Cold War had ended, that Operation Northwoods was finally declassified. When the public read it, disbelief turned to horror. The government that had stood as the beacon of democracy had once contemplated attacking its own citizens to justify a war. It was not carried out, but it was conceived. That alone was enough to stain the idea of absolute trust in authority. The existence of Operation Northwoods revealed something deeper than a single plan. It showed how fear can twist morality, how even the most democratic institutions can drift toward tyranny when paranoia takes hold. It demonstrated the dangerous power of narrative, the idea that if people can be convinced of a lie, they can be led to war. In the decades that followed, the revelation of Northwoods would fuel endless debates about government transparency, conspiracy, and truth. It would be cited as evidence that in moments of crisis, secrecy becomes a weapon. The plan was never executed, but its shadow lingers. It is a reminder that even the freest nation on earth once stood ready to deceive its own people, not out of hatred, but out of fear. And sometimes, fear is the most dangerous enemy of all. 3. The Tuskegee Experiment. When science lost its soul in the heart of Alabama, during the Great Depression, a quiet and horrifying experiment began. It was 1932, and America was a nation divided not only by wealth but by race. Under the guise of medical research, the United States Public Health Service launched what it called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The name sounded clinical, scientific, even noble. But behind the language of research lay an act of cruelty that would haunt generations. 600 African American men, mostly poor sharecroppers, were recruited with promises of free medical care, meals, and burial insurance. What they were not told was the truth. 400 of them had syphilis, a disease that slowly destroys the body from within, while the rest served as a control group. The doctors claimed they would treat them, but they never intended to. Instead, the men became unwitting subjects in a decades-long experiment to study how the disease progressed when left untreated. These men trusted the doctors because they believed in the power of science, in the goodness of the government that had promised to help them. They came for checkups, for blood tests, for what they thought were treatments. They were given placebos, fake medicines, and even painful spinal taps that were described as special treatments. The reality was far darker. The government wanted to observe how syphilis destroyed the human body, not to cure it. When World War II broke out, penicillin was discovered to be a reliable cure for syphilis. Yet even then, the doctors in Tuskegee refused to treat the men. They watched as their subjects grew sick, lost their sight, their minds, and finally their lives. Wives were infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. Families were destroyed for the sake of data that could have been gathered ethically, compassionately, and with consent. The study continued for 40 years. 4 decades of deceit. 4 decades of suffering in silence. It wasn't until 1972 that the truth came to light, when a whistleblower leaked information to the press. The story shocked the nation. The words, Tuskegee Experiment, became synonymous with betrayal, with the perversion of science for power. In 1997, more than 60 years after the experiment began, President Bill Clinton publicly apologized on behalf of the United States government. He stood before the survivors and their families and said, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence." It was a moment of acknowledgement, but it could not erase what had been done. The Tuskegee Experiment is not just a tragedy of science. It is a story of how racism and arrogance corrupted medicine, how the pursuit of knowledge became an excuse for cruelty. It revealed the dangers of blind trust in authority, and the devastating consequences when human beings are treated as disposable. To this day, the echoes of Tuskegee linger in the deep mistrust many African Americans feel toward the medical establishment. It is not paranoia. It is memory. The legacy of that betrayal runs through generations, a reminder that progress without humanity is not progress at all. The men of Tuskegee were not numbers in a report. They were fathers, sons, and husbands. They believed in a system that saw them as less than human. Their suffering became a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of a nation that prided itself on freedom and equality. And in that reflection, America was forced to confront a truth that science alone could never heal. 4. The coup that never made the textbooks. The business plot. In the early 1930s, America stood on the brink of collapse. The Great Depression had brought the country to its knees. Banks failed, jobs vanished, and millions of citizens struggled to find food and shelter. Out of the despair, a new leader emerged, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who promised hope through bold reforms. His New Deal aimed to restore faith in government and to rebuild the shattered economy by empowering workers and restricting the unchecked power of corporations. But for some of the nation's wealthiest men, his policies were seen as a declaration of war. Behind closed doors, in the smoky boardrooms of America's financial elite, whispers began to circulate. Roosevelt, they claimed, was leading the nation towards socialism. His regulation of banks, taxation of the wealthy, and support for unions were viewed not as salvation, but as betrayal. And so, in 1933, a group of businessmen, industrialists, and financiers began to conspire in silence. Their goal was simple but audacious: remove Roosevelt from power and replace him with a military figure who would restore control to the corporate elite. They called it a plan to save America. History would remember it as the business plot. To execute this coup, the conspirators sought out a man they believed could command respect and loyalty among veterans, a man who had once been one of the most decorated Marines in American history, Major General Smedley Butler. Butler had served in nearly every major conflict of the early 20th century. He was admired, charismatic, and fiercely patriotic. They thought he could be persuaded to lead an army of veterans to march on Washington, seize control, and install a dictator under the guise of preserving democracy. But they underestimated him. Instead of joining them, Butler listened carefully, gathered their evidence, and then did something they never expected: he exposed them. In 1934, he testified before Congress, revealing the plot in meticulous detail. He named names, described meetings, and presented what he knew. The investigation that followed, known as the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, confirmed that there had indeed been discussions and preparations for a coup. Yet, despite the evidence, no one was punished. The names of the businessmen involved, some tied to major banks and corporations, were quietly removed from official reports. The story disappeared from headlines almost as quickly as it had surfaced. The business plot was buried not because it lacked truth, but because it threatened to shatter the illusion of control. The idea that America's most powerful men could attempt to overthrow their own government was too dangerous for the public to fully comprehend. Newspapers downplayed it, politicians ignored it, and history moved on. But General Butler did not. In the years that followed, he became a vocal critic of the very system that had made those men rich. He called war a racket, driven by profit and power rather than patriotism. His warnings were ignored by many at the time, but they resonate even now, echoing through the corridors of power. The business plot reveals how fragile democracy can be when greed outweighs conscience. It shows that the greatest threats to freedom are not always foreign enemies, but those who live within its borders, cloaked in respectability, wealth, and influence. For decades, this story was missing from the textbooks, erased from collective memory. Yet its lesson is timeless. Even in the land of liberty, power will always test the limits of morality. And sometimes, the heroes who save democracy are not the ones who fight wars abroad, but the ones who refuse to betray it at home. 5. Project MKUltra, Mind Control. And the CIA's experimentation era. After the end of World War II, America was not at peace. The battlefield had changed. The Cold War had begun, and the enemy was not a single nation, but an idea. The fear of communism spread through every level of society. The Central Intelligence Agency, newly formed and growing in influence, became obsessed with one question: could the human mind itself be controlled? This obsession led to one of the darkest chapters in American history. It began in secrecy, under the name Project MKUltra. It was launched in 1953, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and code names. Its mission was clear: to find a way to manipulate human thought, to erase memories, to create obedience, and even to build the perfect spy. To do this, the CIA turned people into test subjects without their consent. The experiments were as varied as they were disturbing. Scientists administered powerful hallucinogens such as LSD to unsuspecting citizens, prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients. Some were told they were participating in medical research. Others had no idea what was being done to them. They were dosed, observed, and often left in mental ruins. The agency wanted to know how far the mind could be broken, how easily a person could be made to confess, to comply, or to forget. The program went far beyond drug testing. Subjects were subjected to hypnosis, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. Files later revealed that some of these experiments took place in hospitals, universities, and even in brothels run by CIA operatives. Hidden cameras recorded every reaction. Behind each experiment was a chilling belief that morality could be set aside in the pursuit of control. Among the victims was a man named Frank Olson, a scientist who worked for the government and began questioning the ethics of what he saw. He was secretly given LSD by his superiors. Days later, he fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. The official report claimed suicide, but decades later, evidence suggested that Olson might have been silenced to protect the program. His death became a symbol of the secrecy and paranoia that defined MKUltra. In 1973, as public scrutiny of intelligence operations grew, the CIA destroyed most of the MKUltra records. Tens of thousands of documents were burned to erase the paper trail. But fragments survived, and they told enough of the story to expose the horror. 2 years later, the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission began investigating illegal activities within American intelligence agencies. When MKUltra was finally revealed to the public, it shocked the world. A government that claimed to defend liberty had conducted experiments that stripped people of theirs. The revelation reshaped public perception of the CIA. It exposed how the fear of losing power can lead even democratic institutions into moral collapse. It showed that the pursuit of control can consume the very ideals it claims to protect. The legacy of MKUltra still lingers in culture and consciousness. It has become a symbol of the dangers of secrecy, a warning of how far a nation might go when paranoia outweighs principle. Project MKUltra was not simply a scientific experiment. It was a mirror reflecting the darkness within the human desire to dominate. It proved that the mind is not only the battlefield of the Cold War, but also the battlefield of conscience. 6. The real story of Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Massacre. In the early years of the 20th century, in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, there stood a neighborhood known as Greenwood. It was a thriving, self-sufficient black community, often called Black Wall Street. Born from the dreams and determination of freed slaves and their descendants, Greenwood was a symbol of what African Americans could achieve in the face of segregation and oppression. The streets of Greenwood were lined with elegant homes, successful businesses, and lively theaters. There were doctors, lawyers, teachers, and entrepreneurs. The community had its own hospital, its own newspapers, and even its own small airport. In a time when most of America forced black citizens to live in poverty and fear, Greenwood stood as a quiet rebellion, a vision of black excellence and independence. But to many outside the community, that success was not seen as progress. It was seen as a threat. In May of 1921, a single accusation set off one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in American history. A young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator named Sarah Page. The story spread quickly through Tulsa, fueled by racism and rage. Within hours, white mobs gathered, armed and ready for vengeance. What began as rumors turned into chaos. The mob marched into Greenwood, destroying everything in its path. Homes were looted, businesses burned, and families fled for their lives. Airplanes, privately owned by local white residents, dropped incendiary bombs on the community below. For 2 days, fire consumed everything that generations had built. By the time it ended, more than 35 city blocks lay in ashes. Thousands were left homeless. Estimates suggest that hundreds of people were killed, though the exact number may never be known. The survivors were forced into internment camps, stripped of their property, and silenced by fear. Insurance companies refused to pay damages. The city refused to rebuild. And history itself refused to remember. For decades, the Tulsa massacre was erased from textbooks and public discussion. It was as if an entire community had been wiped not only from the map but from memory. Teachers did not speak of it. Newspapers buried it. Even the descendants of survivors were often too afraid to tell the story. Silence became the second destruction of Greenwood. But silence does not last forever. In the late 20th century, researchers and activists began uncovering what had been buried. They found photographs, testimonies, and government records that proved the massacre had not been an accident or a riot, but a coordinated act of terror. They exposed how local authorities had supported or ignored the violence, and how justice had been denied for generations. Today, the story of Black Wall Street has reemerged as one of resilience and truth. Descendants of survivors continue to fight for reparations, for acknowledgement, and for the restoration of what was stolen. The ruins of Greenwood have become a monument to what was possible and to what was lost. The Tulsa Massacre is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of how power responds to independence, and how fear turns success into a target. It forces us to confront the reality that progress in America has often been punished, not celebrated. The flames that consumed Greenwood were meant to erase a people's pride. Instead, they lit a spark that refuses to go out. The memory of Black Wall Street lives on, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the strength of those who dared to build a dream in a world determined to destroy it. 7. The Manhattan Project's human cost. In the midst of World War II, when the future of civilization hung in the balance, the United States undertook one of the most ambitious scientific efforts in human history. It was called the Manhattan Project, a secret operation that brought together the brightest minds in physics, chemistry, and engineering. Their mission was to build a weapon so powerful that it could end the war. But behind the story of scientific triumph lies another story, one written in silence, sickness, and sacrifice. The Manhattan Project began in 1942, hidden behind layers of secrecy. Entire towns were built from nothing to house scientists and workers. Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and Hanford in Washington became bustling centers of innovation and isolation. The people who lived and worked there were told only what they needed to know. Many thought they were helping to create a new kind of energy. Few realized they were building the deadliest weapon the world had ever seen. The project consumed vast resources. Thousands labored day and night, unaware of the full scope of what they were part of. Women tested metals, men handled uranium, and children played near buildings that glowed faintly in the night. Radiation was everywhere, invisible and deadly. Safety protocols were minimal, and exposure was constant. Workers began to fall ill with strange symptoms. Their hair fell out, their skin burned, and their bodies weakened. But they were told to stay quiet. The scientists, driven by fear of Nazi Germany developing a similar weapon, pushed forward. Among them was Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who would later be called the father of the atomic bomb. He described the project as both a triumph and a torment. When the first bomb was tested in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945, the world changed forever. The explosion lit up the sky with a blinding light, and Oppenheimer whispered words from ancient scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." A few weeks later, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Then, another on Nagasaki. Over 200,000 people were killed, many of them civilians. The devastation was unimaginable. Cities turned to ash. The air itself became poison. Those who survived the blast carried the scars for the rest of their lives. In Japan, entire generations suffered from radiation sickness, birth defects, and cancers caused by exposure. Back in America, the suffering was quieter but just as real. Many workers who had unknowingly inhaled radioactive dust or handled contaminated materials began to die of mysterious illnesses. For decades, the government denied responsibility. Medical records disappeared, and survivors were told their symptoms were unrelated. Only much later, after lawsuits and investigations, did the truth begin to emerge. The Manhattan Project had created not only a weapon of war but a moral dilemma that still haunts humanity. The scientists who built the bomb had believed they were protecting the world from tyranny. But when they saw what their creation had done, many were filled with regret. Oppenheimer himself became an advocate for nuclear disarmament, warning that mankind could not be trusted with such power. The legacy of the Manhattan Project lives on in every nuclear weapon that still exists today. It reminds us that the line between progress and destruction is thin and often invisible. The same minds that unlocked the atom also unleashed a force that could end civilization. Behind the heroism and innovation lies a haunting truth. The victory that ended one war began a new era of fear. The bomb did not just change the world. It changed what it meant to be human. The price of knowledge, once paid, can never be refunded. And the shadow of that first flash in the desert still stretches across every sunrise. 8. Operation Paperclip. Nazis in America. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The Allies had triumphed over tyranny. The Nazi regime was shattered, its leaders hunted down and put on trial. The war was over, but a new kind of conflict had already begun, one that would not be fought with tanks and bullets, but with technology, intelligence, and science. The United States, facing the Soviet Union in an escalating Cold War, began to fear falling behind in the race for global power. And so, under the cover of secrecy, a plan was born. Its name was Operation Paperclip. At its heart, Operation Paperclip was a moral compromise disguised as national security. The United States government decided to recruit more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians who had once worked for Adolf Hitler's war machine. Many of them were not ordinary scientists. They were men who had served the Nazi regime, who had developed weapons, conducted experiments on human beings, and fueled the machinery of war. Their expertise, however, was too valuable to ignore. The idea was simple. If America did not claim them, the Soviets would. The Cold War demanded technological superiority at any cost. Under this logic, the U.S. brought these men to American soil, erased their Nazi pasts, and gave them new identities, homes, and positions of authority. Some were placed in universities, others in research laboratories. Many joined the newly formed NASA, shaping the very foundation of the American space program. One of the most famous of these recruits was Wernher von Braun, a rocket scientist who had developed the V-2 missile for Nazi Germany, a weapon that rained death on the cities of Europe. After the war, von Braun became a hero in America, the man who would lead the effort to put humans on the moon. His dark past was quietly forgotten as he appeared on television, smiling beside American flags and astronauts. But behind the celebration of scientific progress lay unanswered questions. How many of these men had participated in war crimes? How many had experimented on prisoners in concentration camps? How many victims were silenced to make room for their knowledge? Government officials knew the truth, but they buried it. They altered records, rewrote histories, and justified their actions with the claim that the ends justified the means. Operation Paperclip symbolized the moment when the line between good and evil blurred. The same nation that had fought a war to destroy fascism had secretly given sanctuary to its architects. The same government that had condemned Nazi atrocities now depended on their perpetrators for technological progress. For decades, the details of Operation Paperclip were hidden. The public was told that these scientists were ordinary refugees seeking a new life. It wasn't until classified documents were released in the 1980s that the full scope of the operation was revealed. The truth was uncomfortable, and it forced America to face a moral reckoning. Yes, their work helped launch satellites, develop missiles, and send men to the moon. But it also carried the stain of the past, a reminder that the pursuit of power often demands the abandonment of conscience. Operation Paperclip is more than a story of espionage or science. It is a story of how victory in war can still carry defeat of the spirit. It shows that progress built on silence and denial is progress that forgets its humanity. When we look up at the moon and see the mark of American achievement, we are also looking at the shadow of the past. The rockets that carried mankind beyond the earth were born from a legacy of horror. And history, if we listen closely, still whispers the question that haunted that moment: how much of our soul are we willing to trade for power? 9. COINTELPRO, the war against American activism in the middle of the 20th century, as movements for civil rights and social justice grew louder across the United States. A secret war was being fought within its own borders. It was not a war against a foreign enemy, but against American citizens themselves. The government called it COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. To many who lived through it, it was nothing less than a campaign of fear. Launched by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1956, COINTELPRO was designed to monitor, infiltrate, and neutralize groups considered subversive. But in reality, it became a weapon used to destroy any movement that challenged authority. Civil rights organizations, anti-war protesters, feminist leaders, environmental groups, and student unions were all targeted. The program's goal was not only to collect information, but to silence dissent, to create division and distrust from within. The most aggressive operations were aimed at black activists. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the FBI's main targets. They wiretapped his phones, followed him across the country, and spread false rumors in an effort to discredit him. Agents sent him anonymous letters threatening to expose his private life unless he gave up his activism. They even suggested that he take his own life. It was psychological warfare waged against a man whose only weapon was his voice. But King was not alone. The Black Panther Party, a group that sought to protect black communities and advocate for self-determination, became a prime focus of COINTELPRO's aggression. The FBI labeled them as a domestic threat and used informants, forged documents, and provocations to destroy their unity. Leaders were imprisoned on fabricated charges, and internal conflicts were fueled deliberately by government interference. By the early 1970s, the organization had been dismantled, not by public disapproval, but by systematic sabotage. COINTELPRO extended beyond racial justice movements. It targeted anti-war groups protesting the Vietnam War, accusing them of being communist sympathizers. It infiltrated student movements and labor unions, turning friends against each other. The goal was not just to watch, but to fracture communities from the inside. Fear became a tool of control. The irony of COINTELPRO was painful. The United States, a nation built on the right to speak freely and challenge authority, had turned those very ideals into targets of suspicion. The program ran for 15 years in secret, its files hidden under layers of classification. When it was finally exposed in 1971, it was not through confession, but through rebellion. A group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania. They stole documents, mailed them to the press, and revealed the truth. The revelations were explosive. Americans learned that their government had spied on them, manipulated them, and destroyed lives in the name of security. Congressional investigations followed, and the program was officially shut down. But by then, the damage had been done. Trust between citizens and their government had been shattered. The legacy of COINTELPRO continues to shape the nation. Its tactics, surveillance, infiltration, disinformation have not disappeared. They have evolved, becoming more sophisticated with technology. Many activists today, from journalists to whistleblowers, still feel the echo of those same methods of control. COINTELPRO reminds us that democracy is most fragile not when it is attacked from outside, but when it begins to fear its own people. The program was born from paranoia, from the belief that dissent equals danger. Yet history has shown that dissent is the lifeblood of progress. The story of COINTELPRO is not just about the abuse of power. It is about the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. Every protest, every march, every voice raised in defiance carries within it the memory of those who were watched, followed, and threatened. And in that memory lies the unbreakable truth that freedom must always be louder than fear. 10. The cover-up of nuclear accidents, America's hidden disasters after World War II. As the atomic age began, America stood as a symbol of scientific progress and power. Nuclear energy promised endless potential. It was hailed as the future, a clean and limitless source of energy that would fuel homes, cities, and industries. But behind the optimism lay a darker story, one of negligence, secrecy, and quiet disaster. The same technology that had ended a war also began to quietly end lives. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, nuclear plants and research sites across the United States became the silent stage for accidents and contamination events that the public was never meant to know about. From Washington state to Pennsylvania, from Nevada to Colorado, radiation seeped into air, soil, and water, often for years before anyone admitted the truth. One of the earliest and most severe cases occurred at the Hanford site in Washington state. Built during the Manhattan Project, Hanford produced the plutonium used in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. For decades, radioactive waste from its reactors was dumped into the nearby Columbia River. Workers were exposed daily without protective equipment. Families living nearby noticed strange illnesses, cancers, and birth defects. Yet the government denied any danger, insisting everything was under control. The truth would not come out for decades, when declassified documents revealed that Hanford had released more than 200 million curies of radioactive material into the environment. But Hanford was only the beginning. Across the country, nuclear testing sites in Nevada poisoned the desert air. Entire towns downwind of the explosions began to experience soaring cancer rates. Residents, later called downwinders, were told that the radiation was harmless. Children played outside as dust from the tests settled over their homes. Some developed leukemia before they were old enough to understand the word. By the time the truth surfaced, the damage was irreversible. Then came 3 Mile Island in 1979, near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A partial meltdown at the nuclear plant released radioactive gases into the atmosphere. Officials were slow to inform the public, and conflicting reports fueled panic. Residents fled the area as government spokesmen insisted there was no immediate danger. That phrase would become a haunting refrain in every nuclear accident that followed. Years later, independent studies showed increased cancer rates among nearby populations. Yet the official record remained one of minimal harm. There were other incidents, smaller in scale but no less tragic. In Colorado, the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant leaked plutonium into surrounding neighborhoods. In Kentucky and Ohio, uranium enrichment facilities contaminated groundwater for generations. Each event followed the same pattern: silence, denial, and eventual revelation long after it was too late. The secrecy was not just about protecting national security. It was about protecting the illusion of progress. Nuclear power was the symbol of American modernity, and acknowledging its dangers meant admitting that the dream was flawed. Scientists who spoke out were silenced or dismissed. Workers who got sick were told their symptoms were unrelated. The human cost of maintaining the illusion became invisible, buried beneath patriotic pride. Over time, the truth began to surface through whistleblowers, declassified reports, and investigative journalists. They uncovered a web of negligence that stretched across decades. The same government that had promised safety had allowed countless citizens to live and die in radioactive silence. Lawsuits followed, and eventually small measures of justice were granted. But justice could not undo the contamination. It could not restore the lives that had been lost to secrecy. The cover-ups surrounding America's nuclear past reveal a chilling pattern. Each incident, no matter how devastating, was treated as an isolated event, a mistake that could be managed and forgotten. But taken together, they form a single story, one of a nation so determined to appear invincible that it refused to admit its own vulnerability. Even today, many of the cleanup sites remain dangerous. The Earth still carries the invisible scars of decisions made decades ago. Radiation does not vanish with time. It lingers like the memory of those who were never warned, never protected, never believed. The story of America's hidden nuclear disasters is not only about science or politics. It is about truth. It is about the cost of progress when human lives are treated as acceptable losses. It reminds us that the most dangerous contamination is not always in the soil or the air. Sometimes it is in the silence we choose to keep. As we uncover these 10 hidden chapters of American history, a haunting realization begins to take shape. These stories, separated by time and place, are not random tragedies. They are reflections of a pattern, one that stretches across centuries, linking every secret through a single thread, the pursuit of control. Behind every act of silence, every cover-up, and every betrayal, there was always the same motivation: power protected at any cost. The genocide of Native Americans was not simply about land. It was about control over identity, culture, and destiny. Operation Northwoods was not only a plan of deception. It was an attempt to control belief itself, to rewrite reality in the name of national unity. The Tuskegee Experiment, MK-Ultra, and the nuclear cover-ups all shared that same hunger to dominate the unknown, to play God with human lives under the illusion of progress. In each of these moments, America's greatest strength, its ambition, became its greatest weakness. The drive to lead the world, to innovate, to conquer, turned into a justification for cruelty. The belief that the end justifies the means became the mask behind which morality disappeared. Power did not corrupt all at once. It did so quietly, hidden in classified files, in closed meetings, in whispered lies that promised safety while planting fear. Yet the mirror does not reflect only darkness. For every secret that was buried, there were those who refused to let it stay hidden. Journalists who risked everything to expose the truth. Whistleblowers who spoke up when silence was safer. Ordinary citizens who demanded answers and refused to forget. The resilience of truth is perhaps America's greatest paradox. The same system that allowed these horrors to occur also gave birth to the courage that revealed them. The same democracy that tried to silence dissent also nurtured the voices that would one day bring it to light. And that is the heart of this story. These 10 secrets are not just about what America has done. They are about what it has become because of them. The United States has always stood at the crossroads of light and shadow, between its ideals and its actions. Every time it has chosen secrecy over honesty, power over compassion, control over humanity, it has created the very darkness it claims to fight. But history is not destiny. The mirror of power does not only reflect corruption, it reflects potential. To look into it is not to despair, but to understand. To see how fragile freedom truly is, and how easily it can be traded for comfort, for fear, or for the illusion of safety. The true revelation is not in the secrets themselves, but in what they reveal about us. Every generation inherits the same question. Will we confront our mistakes, or will we repeat them in silence? The answer lies not in the halls of government, or the archives of history, but in the collective conscience of a people willing to see their reflection clearly, unfiltered, unflattering, and unafraid. Because the moment a nation dares to look at its own darkness without turning away, that is the moment it begins to understand its light. History does not end with revelation. It begins there. Every hidden truth that comes to light is not just a story from the past but a warning for the present. The secrets buried beneath America's history are not ghosts of another time. They are living reminders of how easily ideals can be twisted, how silence can become complicity, and how progress can blind those who believe they are on the right side of history. The United States has always called itself a nation of freedom and justice, a place where truth prevails. But freedom without accountability is fragile, and justice without honesty is hollow. To understand the greatness of a nation, one must also confront its failures. The stories of genocide, manipulation, experiments, and cover-ups are not told to destroy faith in a country but to restore it through truth. Because love for one's nation does not mean blind devotion. It means having the courage to see it clearly, to hold it to its highest promises even when it falls short. Each generation inherits the burden of memory. What we choose to remember shapes what we become. The people erased from history, the victims of secrecy, the lives lost in silence, they all deserve more than acknowledgement. They deserve understanding. And understanding requires that we listen, not just to the past, but to the echoes it leaves in the present. The American story is not finished. It is still being written in every act of truth-telling, every protest, every demand for transparency. The darkness of history is not what defines a nation. What defines it is the willingness to face that darkness and transform it into something brighter. Because in the end, the measure of a country is not how it hides its sins, but how it confronts them. Truth, even when painful, is the most powerful form of freedom. And when a nation finally learns to tell its story honestly, without pride or shame, that is when its history becomes not a burden, but a light.